With every new season or major patch or balancing pass, two seemingly opposed groups crawl out of the woodwork. One immediately decides to reroll to whichever spec came out strongest after the tuning. The other will immediately begin mocking anyone who even considers abandoning their main. And honestly, I think both sides are making the same mistake, because your class choice shouldn't be dictated purely by tuning, but it also shouldn't be driven by some weird sense of allegiance to a specific spec. The question should instead be, which choice would actually make my experience with WoW better? So in this video, I want to discuss a clearer way to make that decision. A way to work out whether your class is actually holding you back, whether changing mains would genuinely improve your experience, or whether you're avoiding a reroll just because you feel some sense of allegiance to the character that you're currently on. And I've made both versions of this decision myself. I have stubbornly played an off-meta DPS to the 0.1% title because I loved the spec and believed I could achieve my goals with it. But I have also earned the 0.1% title by re-rolling to a class that better suited my goals and what I wanted at the time. I am also currently in the process of doing that exact thing again. Those decisions weren't contradictory. Re-rolling isn't automatically the right decision, but remaining loyal to a character that you're miserable on is also not the right decision. The term FOTM Reroller has become so common in WoW that it's almost a meme at this point. It describes a player who swaps specs at the slightest whiff of class tuning. They're the first to jump onto the newest S tier spec. They're the first to watch every tier list video that hits their YouTube homepage. The thing is, they also rarely bother to properly learn any of these specs. We have all encountered these types of players. How many Devourer Demon Hunters have you encountered in Mythic Plus this season who barely seem to know what they're doing? Just because the spec is strong does not mean that anyone who touches it will suddenly be good at it. The problem though is that the FOTM Reroller label is now being applied much more broadly than this. WoW players have a strange habit of tying their identity to a particular class or spec. They become the rogue main or the ret paladin guy. Because of that, rerolling can be treated as though someone is abandoning part of their identity to take some easy way out. There is also another weird perception that accomplishments become less legitimate when they're achieved after a reroll. Like, I've seen heaps of posts on X recently dismissing augmentation players as being boosted just because many of them were not playing the spec before it was truly dominant. The assumption is that if you rerolled to this spec, you must be bad and you're carried by the class that you're on. While both of these are silly, there is something that the community does seem to correctly recognize in both of them. Endlessly chasing class tuning can prevent a player from ever becoming truly skilled at anything. But on top of that, they also ignore that endless loyalty to a spec can prevent your enjoyment of the game as well. My own experience playing Retribution Paladin in Season 2 of War Within is probably the best example I can think of here. It was not the meta DPS, but I didn't stick with it because of some stubborn sense of pride or loyalty. I genuinely loved the build, and the tier set that season was really cool, and I understood the spec very, very well. I also believed that I could still achieve my goal of the 0.1% title with it, and I was right. But most importantly, I enjoyed the process of getting there, even if my spec choice was a little bit more frustrating than had I re-rolled at the time. In that situation, remaining as a Ret Paladin player was absolutely the correct decision for me. But that doesn't mean that sticking with your current main is always the correct decision. But how do you actually know when you should be pushing through adversity rather than swapping to something that's more meta at the time? Like, is your urge just a knee-jerk reaction? Would the class swap even genuinely fix the problem? Is the grass actually greener on the other side? Let's start out with the worst reasons to reroll. The first bad reason is basing your decision entirely on class tuning. Obviously, some classes will always be stronger than others. That's just how World of Warcraft is. It's never really going to change. But rerolling purely because one spec has moved above another is essentially the WoW version of chasing trends. Instead, I think there's two much more useful questions to ask. Is the class that I'm playing capable of completing the content that I actually want to play? And is the class choice meaningfully affecting my ability to find groups at that level? I recently saw this graph from Jordan Lower of Statistics on X that I think perfectly represents this point. This is a class representation graph at the time of it being posted. If your goal was to get to 3400 IO on Mage, you'd probably be fine. There are currently 13,000 Mage players who have reached that score, so while you may still encounter some community bias, your class choice here clearly isn't preventing you from achieving content at that level. But if your goal was instead the 0.1% title, only 5 mages currently in the world are within that score range. So is it possible still? Yes, clearly, but it's obviously substantially harder. This is where the nuance around tuning becomes a little bit more important. Mage is in a rough position in Mythic Plus at the moment, specifically at high level push content, but the practical consequences of that do not become significant until the absolute upper end. If you're not playing anywhere near that level, tuning probably should carry far less weight in your own decision. The more relevant question may instead be, am I enjoying the current gameplay style or the gameplay loop of the spec? Another bad reason to reroll is using it as an excuse to avoid improving. Your spec may genuinely be underperforming compared to the absolute best options at the time, but are you currently playing to the best of your ability? If you are grey passing on an off-meta spec, you may deal more raw damage after rerolling, but you will probably still grey pass on the meta spec too. And believe me when I say, a well-played off-meta spec will beat a grey passing meta spec 9 times out of 10, and especially at any content that isn't at the absolute cutting edge of the game. I can use my experience with Unholy Death Knight as a perfect example here. I swapped from Retribution Paladin around a month ago for several reasons, but when it came to actually learning the spec, I was kind of lazy. As a result, my Warcraft log page was covered in grey passes. I had moved to an objectively more powerful spec, but my own performance didn't suddenly go with it. I was actually performing better in a raw sense on my off-meta Paladin than I was on the Death Knight. I eventually had to sit down and properly analyze what I was doing wrong and develop a bit of a better understanding of how Unholy Death Knight worked. But only after doing that did my performance improve. The class was objectively stronger and is objectively stronger at the moment, but I still had to do the work required to access that strength. So before rerolling on a whim, I think you need to do a small little test for yourself. Have you identified exactly what you dislike about your current class? Have you genuinely tried overcoming those difficulties? And would a new specialization actually remove these problems, or would the same weaknesses just follow you across? If you answer those questions honestly, it should make it much easier to work out whether you are reacting to temporary frustration with your current spec, or whether you have a legitimate reason to reroll. So, what about the times when rerolling actually does make sense? The first good reason is pretty obvious. It's that you simply do not enjoy the fundamental gameplay of the spec that you're on anymore. This is much different from struggling to perform. If you do not understand your rotation, you can learn it. If you don't understand your cooldown usage, you can practice it. But if you dislike the basic gameplay loop, improving will not do anything. You'll just get better at playing something that you already don't like. This is especially relevant now after all of the major class reworks. Sometimes the class that you chose is no longer the class that Blizzard has left you with now. There is a difference between giving up on something because it's difficult and then recognizing yourself that the difficulty is itself not enjoyable. The second reason may be that your goals have changed. A spec that is perfectly suitable for weekly keys may become much less suitable if you decide to push for something like the 0.1% title. For the overwhelming majority of players, tier list placements will not prevent you from completing the content that you actually want to do. But at a certain level, it can actually become a very large barrier. The thing that I want to highlight that I don't think people understand here as well is that the whole I sit in LFG and never get any invites thing actually happens to every spec. So there is this sort of sentiment that, like, if you're playing an off-meta spec and you're never getting to run keys at a certain level, it's like, oh, if I played the meta spec, I would be getting instant invites. That may be true to an extent, but it's not universally true. Every single spec, regardless of how strong it is, will hit a barrier. I can say from personal experience now that with my Unholy DK at the moment, if I don't have people online that are playing that I know already, you know, running keys, I will sit on the top of my little LFG hill and refresh the page for hours. It is exactly the same. The difference, though, is that the level at which this starts to happen may change. If you're playing a really weak spec, then the key level that might start to occur will be a tad lower. But the thing is, it doesn't go away immediately. LFG surfing is just almost a fundamental of the game at this point. The final reason to reroll is when the only thing that is keeping you on your current character is either like sunk cost or some sense of identity tied to it. Just because you've invested a lot of time into a character, it doesn't automatically mean that investing more time is the correct decision. The same thing also applies to worrying about being called a FOTM reroller or feeling like changing classes is admitting defeat or something. The people that are judging the decision are not the ones who have to spend their free time playing a class or a character that they don't like anymore. There is nothing admirable about abandoning a class at the first sign of inconvenience, but there is also nothing admirable about spending an entire season miserable simply to prove that you never reroll. Class loyalty is only valuable if it continues to provide you enjoyment and something worth being loyal to. Ultimately, the decision shouldn't be controlled by a tier list, but it also shouldn't be controlled by some weird sense of obligation to remain loyal to a certain character or spec forever. Ask yourself what problem you're actually trying to solve in the game, if there is something that you could do yourself on your current character to overcome this, and if not, would a different spec genuinely help overcome that barrier? You don't need to reroll because your spec is not right at the tip top of a tier list, but you also don't need to spend an entire season playing something that you no longer enjoy or that doesn't align with your in-game goals anymore. The right decision is the decision that allows you to easily work towards your goals and enjoy the process at the same time. If your current character is not achieving both of those, it's probably time to swap. A massive thanks to my YouTube members, The Joy of Checks, Tobias, Yulem, and Is This Real at the Keystone Legend tier, as well as everyone else appearing on the end screen. And also a massive thank you to Nesmo for dropping a huge 100 gifted subs in my Twitch stream last night. Much love to you all. If you'd like to support the channel, you can either click the join button below or follow the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. And as always, thank you to you, the viewer, for hanging out all the way until the end. See you in Azeroth, gamers. Until next time, take care.